more. Widesight TV.
David, I'm going to come to you first. Quite simply, can floating offshore wind coexist harmoniously with the marine environment?
Well, it's quite an interesting question, and it's a straightforward question, I guess. But the straightforward answer is that yes, it can coexist harmoniously with the environment. I think I would go further. I would say that there's a lot of projects out there. We have a few small floating wind projects that are already existing, and they are already coexisting harmoniously in the environment. In offshore wind in general, a lot of hard work goes into the site selection, understanding the environmental impacts through the consenting process and from early phase feasibility studies as well. So a lot of effort goes into managing the potential impacts on the environment and trying to pick the best sites and make sure that we're not having any lasting effects on the environment going forward. So essentially, yes, we can. Now, looking into the future, the industry is obviously expanding. There's going to be more and more projects out there as well, so there's still work to be done to try and understand some of the more nuanced impacts that are going on at the moment, or maybe occurring in the future, especially at a larger scale of floating wind. So there's still work to be done to make sure that we're still in the correct position we need to be, which is managing the impacts, understanding and monitoring them. But essentially, yes, we do a lot of work to understand marine impacts, and we are definitely able to coexist harmoniously as an industry, as an industry viewpoint, yeah.
And from really a technical perspective, actually, we are in quite a favorable position with floating offshore wind in that the technical development side is still quite at an early infancy stage, which means that if we understand the environmental receptors and their implications on the technology early on, the technology developers can actually take into account the environmental drivers in their technology development, which will then further support the coexistence of floating offshore wind in the marine environment.
Thank you. So you just mentioned the environmental drivers. What are the key considerations? And also a secondary question, how does that differ from fixed foundation wind turbines? I'll come back to you, David, and then perhaps we'll come back onto you.
So key considerations for floating wind, I think it's sometimes better to take a step back and realise that floating wind as a whole industry, we have a lot of understanding around the interactions with the environment. And there are some things that won't change. There's some things around ornithology, for example, that will largely be the same, and other key impacts as well. Now, some obviously key changes will be the differences that the foundations have on the marine environment. So whether that is a reduction in underwater noise, a reduced benthic footprint on the seabed, those are some of the obvious points that come up to mind when you think about the key differences. There are a number of smaller changes that we don't yet understand. So there's impacts on aviation potentially that we don't quite have an answer to yet, whether how the movement of a floating turbine could affect differently on the aviation assessment that's done for offshore wind. But as a large point, there are differences between fixed and floating. We're not starting again with floating compared to fixed. We've got a really good basis of information. And there are obviously some key points that we will have to try and understand better at a commercial scale over how those interactions are. And that includes the underwater noise, the benthic ecology points, but also aspects around safety, navigational safety. We've got obviously mooring lines potentially over a large scale, which has impacts for navigation and shipping and vessels. And the displacement of other sea users as well. So there's interactions with the commercial fishing industry and other sea users. So they all have to be taken into account. There's still learning to be done, but we're not starting from scratch, essentially.
Really, I think David covered that quite comprehensively there, but I think just to add, the environmental receptors really obviously haven't changed. It's still the same marine mammals, the same ornithology, the same issues that you need to consider, but obviously from a technical perspective, the really key difference is the motions and the foundation. So, for example, one key difference is the issue of the air gap. So obviously in offshore wind, we need to minimize the amount of bird collisions with the turbines themselves, and really a key driver in doing that is sometimes increasing the hub height of the turbines and increasing the air gap, which means that we leave more space for the birds to fly underneath the rotor safely. Now, for fixed foundations, obviously that increases the overturning moment on the foundations themselves, and you can just make the piles bigger. Obviously, that impacts the foundation design and the foundation cost, but in terms of floating offshore wind, when you increase the hub height, you're actually increasing the motions by quite a bit. And we're already struggling in the technology design really to keep these foundations within the allowable motion limits that the turbine itself can function properly as it's designed to. So really we need to understand all those drivers from really early on so that the technology designers can understand the requirement for the hub height and calculate their loads correctly from the very beginning to size those foundations correctly from the very beginning.
So there's loads of really good work going on to mitigate and manage that impact on the environment. Is there anything else you'd say on that? Are there any other initiatives you'd fall into that kind of pocket?
Yeah, I think there's loads of really good industry initiatives at the moment. There's the Crown Estate, who've got a programme of work across offshore wind, but is now beginning to get more of a focus on floating wind as well. So there's some really good projects being led by them, which is great to see. There's also the ORE Catapult Floating Wind Centre of Excellence, which is a really exciting project. They've got a programme of projects being across technology, supply chain, environmental consents, and towards the net zero side of things as well that they're looking at to try and help the industry. And there's specific projects on the environmental interactions with floating wind that Xodus are supporting ORE Catapult on as well. So it's really great to be involved in those initiatives and see them come to fruition. The one thing I think that does need to happen is that a lot of these programs, it's really important that the information and the findings for these programs are shared throughout the industry and actually are taken on and built upon and built into the processes that developers are going through with the regulators, with the competent authorities, to make sure that the learning is actually affecting what we're doing in terms of consenting new projects and trying to minimize the environmental impacts through things like engineering changes from the technical side of things as well. So there's loads of projects out there, and it's just making sure that information is fed back into the process that we're going through.
So let me throw this one at you. You've talked about, we need to know more and we need to kind of continue to learn. What do we not know enough about right now?
I think I mentioned before that there's some of the key differences between fixed and floating wind. Obviously, there are key elements that are slightly different between the two. The things like the aviation, the things like the anchor spread on the seabed and things like that. And I mentioned before that ornithology is relatively similar between the two, but there are slight differences in terms of how birds might use the floating foundation itself to roost and things like that. We don't, because we haven't seen commercial scale wind farms, there are impacts that we need to investigate at that scale and understand how that is going to affect the environmental assessments that we do and how we can try and, if we need to, mitigate those impacts in the future. I think what we need to learn more about is, obviously once we go through that process and see the commercial scale things, is keep an eye on how we are integrating the environment, the technical development, the supply chain, the economic development. All of these things need to be integrated in to provide a holistic approach, and this is something that at Xodus we kind of try and promote a lot with integrated teams within Xodus. But that understanding is really crucial to provide the feedback chain between those different elements to allow these projects to develop with a complete understanding of what is going on in the consenting sector, the economic implications of any changes that is done to the technical side of things. They're all linked together, and there's no point in looking at them separately. So what we need is a focus on the integrated consideration of all these aspects for floating wind and looking towards how we can develop those into a sustainable future for the industry, which is where we need to go to meet net zero targets in the future.
The one thing I'd like to add, obviously, is that for floating wind, we still have a lot of technical uncertainties. These projects haven't been live for a very long time, so we don't know a lot about their full life cycle. And obviously, the projects that are in the water now are very small, so we don't know a lot about how we can what we can do with larger projects. So, for example, a key thing in terms of the environmental impact is, for example, reducing the number of anchors. So, for larger projects, we can try and optimize the configurations to share anchors to minimize the impact on the seabed. So, that's one area that a lot of research is going into. Yeah, definitely. So, lots really to think about on the technology side, and obviously decommissioning as well. Think about the full life cycle. So, understand what we're actually going to do when these assets, and such a very large number of them, come to their end of life. What are we going to do with the recovery of the mooring lines, and also thinking about the full life cycle emissions of these things as well.
Energy. Energy. Marine. Energy. Power. WideSight TV.